Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 2315 or World History 1. So again, just like last week, this week we're going to take a look at a couple of brief case studies that kind of go in conjunction with the reading you've been doing in the textbook this far. So really, when we look at the ancient world, and we're still sort of on this topic of life and civilization and then empires emerging out of the great river valleys of the world. And last week we did a case study looking at Babylon rising and falling within Mesopotamia to see sort of these trends that are playing out in the Mesopotamian area, the Fertile Crescent area. And this week we're going to do a case study mostly on Han China. They're going to be coming about in the Bronze Age in China. They're somewhat contiguous with the large empires with which you're probably more familiar, like Egypt, Rome, Greece, those kinds of things. Han China kind of spreads, it's going on while all that's playing out in the Mediterranean world. And so we're going to look a little bit, we're going to look at Han China with some level of depth and sort of look at how they came about and some of the things they achieved during their time in China. And then we're really briefly going to take a look at what's going on in Harappan, India, or what is known as the Indus River civilizations or the Indus Valley civilizations. And so really we're not going to spend a great deal of time on India, and there's a historiographical reason for that. Something that I'll talk about when we get to that part of the lecture. But long story short, we're not going to pay a lot of attention to India because, to be very honest, as historians and as scholars, it's an area that we don't yet fully understand. The first excavations that began there were in the early 20th century under the British Empire. Those things were badly misinterpreted because of the social climate in which they were excavated. The issue wasn't really revisited because of the chaos that sort of happened in India's partition in 1947. And it's not really until the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, that we really started doing more and more in-depth research into these Harappan or IVC, as we call them, Indus Valley civilization cultures. And so with that being the case, it's kind of the newer field of study. Han China has been studied ad nauseum for hundreds of years, and the documentary record that was left to people was quite a bit better than what we have in India. India is still a bit of a mystery to us, and so with that being the case, I can't sit here and comfortably talk about dates and places and major events and things that happened in Harappan, India in the same way I can about Han China. Because, to be real blunt, I don't know, and it's not just that I haven't done my research or my homework, it's that historians have yet to come up with a conclusive answer to those kinds of basic questions about these societies. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about when it comes to the Harappan culture is more about what I do know was unique about them and made them different from the other civilizations we looked at. But I'm going to leave out a lot of the basic structural knowledge that you would see in the other case studies that we look at. And so that's the goal today. And the purpose, the reason that I'm doing these case studies in this way, might seem like I'm kind of belaboring the point and dragging this early facet of the class out. But what is important, and the reason that I like to point these out and make them a little bit different and set them off, is because of that very issue of historiography. Generally speaking, Mesopotamia has always been treated by historians as the origins of civilization. And it wasn't until a later date that people had to go back and revise that view and go, well, wait a minute. There's stuff going on in China that it far surpasses what we see in the Mediterranean or in the Near East or in Mesopotamia or in Egypt or any of these other places. And so you kind of, what we're trying to do is sort of correct the historical imbalance. We do want to pay ample attention to what made these areas different. And in particular, the purpose of our case study today is we're going to be left with some real lasting legacies that make the region of India unique, that make the region of China unique in world history. It's what kind of separates them out from other areas. And so these areas have not been paid as much attention when it comes to the true rise of civilization, and they have been overlooked to this point. And then also, they're going to leave some really lasting legacies that are going to continue on and things that we're going to have to pay attention to in our class. So without further ado, we're going to dive in. Like I said, I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about the Han Dynasty, and then we'll touch briefly on the Harappan Dynasty before I wrap this up. But you have a rather short PowerPoint lecture to go over this week, relatively speaking to other weeks. And your reading is also somewhat short, in that it's only a section of a textbook. And so you'll see that from last week to this week, there's kind of an imbalance on the reading. Sometimes it's rather heavy, but I try to come back and make up for it with a light week afterwards. So, without further ado, we talk about the Han Dynasty. And the Han Dynasty is generally dated from about 202 BCE up until about 220 Common Era. So it's happening really during the Bronze Age is when the Han Dynasty is coming into power and coming into prominence. But the Han Dynasty, you know, a lot of times people look, when you're dealing with history, they always want to see the first imperial state, the first city to come out. But sometimes the first isn't always the most important. And the Han Dynasty is not the first imperial state in China. That would actually be the dynasty that came right before it, the Qin Dynasty. So the Qin Dynasty was really, really short-lived, to be honest. The Qin Dynasty was a transient dynasty that only lasted for about 17 years. It was not even a generational dynasty where you see power going from one generation to the next. It only exists between 221 BC and 206 BC. But the Qin Dynasty came to power after about 200 years of constant conflict and warfare in China. And it goes back, everything is a pattern of cause and effect. I don't bring up aspects of these societies and then just kind of leave them out and go, well, I just told you about it because it's fun. It's interesting. There's a purpose for me drawing a lot of these things out. And I talked about China in the Neolithic period was practicing slash and burn agriculture. So my cat decided he couldn't help it. He had to come say hi. But they're practicing slash and burn agriculture. And what that means is that land, despite China having this massive, massive territory of land, not all of it's arable and not all of it's usable. So there's fierce competition. There's a lot of competition in China that is driving people into this conflict, into this competition for land. Because their agricultural methods adapted later to actually make the land sustainable agriculture. They're not practicing sustainable agriculture in the Neolithic. What they're doing is they're basically destroying the land and then moving on to the next territory. And so that's what led to that 200-year period of internecine warfare, where it was just constant skirmishes over land and resources there. But when the Qin Dynasty comes to an end in in 206 BCE, it's happening due to numerous peasant rebellions and uprisings. The peasants are the ones who are sort of bearing the brunt of the economic competition in society, and so they're very, very unhappy, and they start leading revolts against their ruling class. And one of these rebellions is led by a guy named Liu Bang. He would beat out, there was a lot of different rebellions going on under the end of the Qin, but his will come to the fore. And Bang is going to take control from Qin leadership by invading the Qin heartland in the east of China in 206. And so it's going to be Liu Bang's rebellion that comes to the forefront and is responsible for collapsing the last vestiges of the Qin dynasty. Now, there's a 4-year period in between 206 BCE and 202 BCE where there is conflict, where there's not everybody's ready to recognize Liu Bang as the new leader of China. There's a lot of parties involved, and they're going to be, mostly the competition falls between two states. There's a principality known as Western Chu, and then there's another principality known as the Han. This 4-year period is called the Chu-Han contention. So this happens between 206 and 202 BCE. And at the end of this period of conflict, Liu Bang, who is he's basically a governor in the Han territory or the Han principality, they will come out on top of this conflict, and they establish a new ruling dynasty from his descendants, which they are going to basically become the new imperial dynasty, and that will give birth to the Han dynasty. So he was a ruler of a minor fiefdom known as Hanzong, and so he is going to be the one that would ultimately turn this small state in central China into the new ruling class of the new Han dynasty. So that is really the origins and where the Han Dynasty comes from. They're going to basically become the leading rebel faction that takes over after the Qin collapse. So ultimately, the Han Dynasty is going to be remembered for a number of things they achieve. They're in power for a decent amount of time, about a 400-year period. By the end, they split into the Eastern and Western Han factions. That's something you can read about in your textbook. I don't address that too much in this case study here. We're going to treat them as the entire period is the Han Dynasty period. Ultimately, once they seized power from the Qin, they're going to build upon some of the Qin traditions. They don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, we're going to burn the whole system to the ground and start from scratch. They build on a lot of the policies of the Qin. And legally, the Qin had practiced what they call a legalistic tradition. They have some established ideas about people's behavior in public, their duties to their family and society. Those ideas are already clearly within Chinese society. But the Han are going to establish a lot of new things that are going to make China unique in the overall scope of world history. So Liu Bang's descendants are going to become the rulers of the Han Dynasty. They're known creatively as the House of Liu. And they begin a policy of aggressive military expansion. In the first two years of the Han Dynasty's rule, they actually are not able to just go striking out and bringing people under their control. Right in the offset, they take over, the Han Dynasty is established, and for 2 years they're forced to submit to outside leadership. They're not powerful enough to stand on their own. There's a confederation of people from the north of China, what the area known as the steppe lands. It's like the sort of grassy, hilly territory north of China. There's a confederacy of people there known as the Xiongnu. And the Xiongnu are going to immediately invade Han China, sensing a weakness in the new regime. And this would lead to a number of years of war between the Xiongnu Confederacy and the Han Dynasty in China. So, in fact, it's the war with the Xiongnu that it drives the Han Dynasty to start expanding the Great Wall of China. The rudiments of the Great Wall were built under the Qin Dynasty. They started putting a wall up on the northern border. But it starts to really grow rapidly under the Han because they're trying to use it to keep the Xiongnu invaders out from the north. They didn't want these steppe people to be able to overrun the Han Dynasty. And so they start building that wall and expanding that out quite a bit during the Han Dynasty. A lot of what we tend to see as modern stretches of the wall were built out during the Han Dynasty, although arguably you could say that most of the Great Wall has been rebuilt and very little of the original structure is actually retained. And most of the areas that you see it as a tourist, you're seeing rebuilt wall that was put up in 1980. So I digress. It has nothing to do with ancient world history. But Emperor Wu is hands down going to be the most notable emperor of the Han Dynasty. He's the 7th ruler of the House of Liu, and he reigns from 140 BCE to 87 BCE. This made him one of the longest living rulers of the Han Dynasty. He was in there, as you can see from those dates, for a really long time. He was in power. But under him, they start making numerous incursions into South China. And they go even beyond that. They reach as far south as Vietnam. But this brings the entire South China region into the Han imperial structure. And this structure is going to last for centuries. And really, when we look at this, by bringing in the south of China and building the border wall on the north, essentially what the Han achieved with their military expansion is building out the modern-day borders of China. From that point forward, the borders change. They're going to shift. Sometimes they go in, sometimes they come out a little bit. But China is one of those rare cases in world history where more or less what you're seeing today, the boundary lines that you're looking at, and things change here and there. As I said, I'm not saying it's a perfect correlation. But more or less, if you look at a map of China today, the Han Dynasty had already claimed all that territory back in the early part of Han history. And so really what we're looking at here is the Han Dynasty made modern China. Ever since that date, China has been, even though you have different dynasties, different families ruling over, different ruling classes, different rules, That's the boundary line of China pretty much for the rest of human history. And it's established by the Han, and it's mostly under Emperor Wu that these military conquests were made possible. It's also under Wu's armies that they start carrying out these conquests and campaigns in Korea, in the Korean Peninsula. By 108 BCE, the Korean Peninsula was entirely under the control of the Han Dynasty. So really what we're seeing is that under Emperor Wu alone, the 7th emperor of the Han Dynasty, they basically built the modern-day boundaries of China, and then they went beyond, and they've gone as far south as Vietnam, they've gone to Taiwan, they've gone up to Korea. All of these areas are now brought under the control of the Han Dynasty. So, finally, after all of that, this problem on their northern border, they're busting out, they're taking Korea, they're taking the south. Everything's going well in those areas, but they're still fighting this border war. They still haven't really gotten the Xiongnu under control up there. And so it's the fight with them is going to continue after Emperor Wu's death, but it would ultimately end in Han victory in 89 Common Era. And so with that boundary line set, there you have basically China, and a little bit more than what we would call modern-day China. But with each passing victory, the Han Dynasty is going to spread its influence, its artistic traditions, and the local and centralized governmental structures that it uses, its language, its heritage, its customs. All these things are going into brand new areas, and they are creating a common, unified, in many ways, a Chinese culture. And I know that that might be oversimplification because we're not dealing with one single ethnicity or linguistic group when we talk about China. But for the most part, the majority of people that are living in China today who consider themselves to be Chinese are made up of what they call ethnic Han people. They trace their ethnic lineage back to the spread of the Han Dynasty during this period, and mostly under Emperor Wu. So, the Han are going to be establishing some pretty important domestic policies that are going to sustain throughout much of China's history, and some of which right up into the modern period. It's during the Han period that the standard Han or Hanzi script is going to be established. And the two major languages that still exist in China today, Cantonese and Mandarin, are both written in Han script. Their writing systems are translated into these Han characters. So it's not even just China that uses this. The Han Dynasty establishes this in China, but it spreads beyond. Today, when you look at most languages in Asia, like Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, they're all written in some variation of the Hanzi script. And so really the common language, the common writing system, the actual script that we're using, that they use to write in Asia, is going to be established by the Han Dynasty, again, largely under the reign of Emperor Wu. The script, the reason that the script is coming into usage during this time period, you can look at precursors in the Shang Dynasty and the Qin Dynasty. They were using symbols, they were using characters, but they didn't have a written language. They had basically divination language. You would carve symbols onto a bone and then throw it in the fire to see how it broke or cracked. And so that would be basically the closest thing they had to a writing system before. But when the Han come along, they say, look, we got to take over this area and we need to run a bureaucracy. We need to have a governmental language that we can use to write things down and document our history, document our tax policies, document everything we're doing in our society. And so they're going to put Hanzi, or the Han script, into place for that. They're going to be able to utilize that as a governmental language, or a business in which their governmental or their political affairs can be carried out. And so the rise of written language in that area goes hand in hand with political shifts. And that does require us to pay some attention to what the Han are doing politically. They are setting up a very, very, very effective central bureaucracy. The emperor in Han society was seen as semi-divine and as a figure of pretty much absolute authority. Basically, the buck stops with the Han emperor. They get to make the final decision on everything at the end of the day. But most Han rulers were not particularly autocratic. That wasn't how they saw themselves really working in the real world. In the real world, they would employ a class of scholars and noblemen, and they help them to maintain order. And the way that the Han structure works is when they take over these new areas, they don't say, okay, everybody in charge here is gone. The whole structure that was in place before, we're ripping it down. That's not how the Han build their empire. What the Han do is they say, you were an independent state before we showed up and conquer you. You're going to be an independent state afterwards. You run your affairs. Whoever was in charge before is going to be in charge afterwards. It's just when they collect all the taxes, they don't get to put it in their pocket anymore. That money comes up to us and at the end day. At the end of it, the Han dynasty takes the tax dollars. It takes the money, and it uses it for central building projects. So the emperor is really the top of the hierarchy in this society. They have near absolute authority, and they're going to rely on this, but they did operate under this basic hierarchy. And so they're going to have different levels of Han society. Everybody has their role and their place. The person on top clearly is the emperor, and then you have a small nobility or ruling class, and it kind of steps all the way down until you get to the bottom rung of Han society, which, as it was in most societies back then, would be slaves. They established this really effective bureaucracy under the reign of Emperor Wu. And one of the ways he helps maintain this bureaucracy is, in a way, he establishes what could be called a state religion, although there's some argument over whether or not Confucianism, which is what he's going to establish, constitutes a religion or simply a philosophy. But Confucianism will become a state sort of educational and political structure. They base everything they do in the Han Dynasty on Confucian ideology and sort of thought. And so Confucianism is hard to describe. It's a socio-political religious structure. Some people call it a philosophy. Other people call it a religion. Some people like to say it's neither and it's both all at the same time. But it's a way of thinking established by the philosopher Confucius. He lived from 551 BCE to 479 BCE. So he lived a little bit before the Han Dynasty is established. But what it's all about, and this is what Confucianism says, there's no Godhead. There's no deity at the top. You don't pray to somebody to make something go better. What Confucianism says is that it's a series of rules. It emphasizes duty, accountability, etiquette, dedication to family, and society and social propriety. It puts them in as sacred ideals. A lot of people have described Confucianism, at least as best I understand it, not being an expert in this area. They say Confucianism takes the secular and it makes it sacred. So in other words, God isn't going to punish you for not being a decent father and husband. You're going to suffer under society for not being a decent father and husband. You have a role that you need to play. If society wants to get better, if society wants to progress, if society wants to grow and become better articulated, then it needs its individual pieces, the citizens, to act right. I've got to be a good father and husband at home. I need to be a good businessman out in public. When the government calls on me to pick up arms and fight for my independence and my empire, then I need to be prepared to do that. In a lot of ways, Confucianism is kind of like republicanism, for those of you familiar with republicanism in the early American Republic. It's about the society's more important than me, and I have a duty to the society. If I have to give up my personal wealth, my life, anything that on the line, my property, it gets put in front of me. It's for the betterment of society. And so that's the way Confucianism is. As you can imagine, without a Godhead, it doesn't say you need to do these things right because of God, or you're going to be punished by burning in hell or something like that. It just says you have a responsibility to do that for the betterment of society. You should be able to see that this is going to, without me having to go too deep into the actual tenets or the dogma of Confucianism, if there even is such a thing, then ultimately what you can see is this helps keep peace, stability, prosperity in Han China. It tells the agricultural peasant, don't worry about what the rich guy next to you has. Shut up and do your job. It's what you need to do to keep society running, and it makes you a decent person too. And so they established Confucianism as a state thought process, as a state philosophy, as a state religion. And it says to everybody in that hierarchy from top to bottom, you have a job to do, you have a role to play, And this is going to help the growth of the Han Dynasty. It's what helps maintain order and stability in the Han Dynasty, the establishment of Confucianism. So I've given you some examples of, I've shown you some maps where Confucianism sort of starts and where it spreads, the Han social structure, some examples of Hansi script. There is another thing that's going to happen under the reign of Emperor Wu and some of his descendants after that, and that is the expansion of the Silk Road in China. So the Han, for the most part, are focusing during a lot of their early years on stopping these raids from the north, from the Xiongnu Confederation in the north. But once they do effectively boot the Xiongnu out and they win that military conflict, they do a few things. First, they're looking at a lot of trade routes that pass through there. They need to have these trade routes protected. The Xiongnu Confederacy has been pushed back, but it doesn't mean that everything is all quiet on the northern border. So they start building out the Great Wall as a means of defending these trade routes. And so by around 115 BCE, you've had the defeat of the Xiongnu Confederacy, and the Han Dynasty is going to start to formalize the already existing trade networks to build out what you probably are familiar with as the Silk Road trading network. So China is really going to be the #1 player in pushing the development of this network. Their roads are safe. They're protected. You can travel through there without getting attacked by bandits and robbers. Their taxation systems are pretty orderly and clean. And so this is a critical shift in global history. The Silk Road doesn't just open up a path for products to move, but it actually leads to the spread of religions, philosophies, technologies, cultivatable crops, domesticatable animals. All these things spread along the Silk Road, and they move from East Asia, the Han Dynasty in our case in this time period, but they're basically connecting the coast of the Pacific and later on all of South Asia, India, and those regions too. They all get connected to the Silk Road. And so the whole old world now, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, is connected with stops on the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea and the Levant and all these areas in between. East Africa gets drawn into this trading network as well. It creates not just the spread of goods and people, but you see the spread of ideas, technology, philosophies, religions. Everything spreads along the Silk Road in the ancient world. And it's expanded and really professionalized by the Han Dynasty. And this is a major, major achievement. So when we look at the Silk Road, it's not just important to Chinese history. It boasts and hastens internal developments in China, in Korea, in India, in Japan. All of these areas of East Asia, it connects them to the outside world, and it allows them to develop more rapidly and more efficiently as they move forward through history. So, ultimately, like all good things have to come to an end, so too does the Han Dynasty. Their collapse has some economic and religious components involved in them. We see that the way that they established themselves is they built their economic policy around defending trade and the trade routes and establishing the Silk Road. Religiously, in a way, I think I would argue that Confucianism forms a sort of religion for the Han Dynasty in China. And so what you're going to see is that both these structures come under attack towards the end of the Han Dynasty. The trouble all starts, it starts a number of years back. Nothing ever happens overnight in a single instance. But there are two major uprisings that are going to take place in 184 Common Era. The one I want you to be familiar with is the Yellow Turban Uprising, but there's also something called the Five Pecks of Rice Revolt. They all happened in the same year. What these are is they're peasant revolts. They're widespread peasant revolts that they're targeting the ruling classes of China. The revolts are dominated by pretty much every other peasant revolt, intense poverty amongst the peasant classes. But it's not just that. The peasants are very, very impoverished. They're really suffering. But there also is, under the Confucian sort of structure of the Han Dynasty, there is a suppression of any ideologies beyond Confucianism. And the main one here is Taoism. Taoism has been outlawed by the Han Dynasty. You're not allowed to practice Taoism. And so a number of these rebels who formed the Yellow Turban Uprising and later the Five Pecks of Rice Revolt, they are going to be Taoists who have to practice in secret. So you can see there's sort of a religious and economic underpinning for these revolts. They're not just mad because they're just stiflingly poor. They're also upset because they're not allowed to practice their particular philosophy or way of life as Taoists. So the Han does put both these revolts down. And they're able to effectively regain control, but the cat is kind of out of the bag at that point. You can see the fissures and the breaks in the Han Dynasty. And then it kind of the final push to end the Han Dynasty actually comes from within. They start to have fractures within the royal family. There's a lot of palace intrigues, and it tends to start with there's a commander named He Ji. And he is calling for the execution of all of the royal court's eunuchs. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with eunuchs, these are castrated servants. Essentially, they are male servants who have had their genitals removed because the attitude of people back then was somebody with genitals poses a threat. They're high on testosterone, they can fight, and then also they can sire children with royal ladies. And they can start to taint the House of Liu's bloodline. And so the people who served the royal family would have to undergo ritual castration before they could get this role. Well, the eunuchs, despite not being able to procreate and have children of their own who might take power, they do wield a lot of power behind the scenes because they have access to the royal family into the royal court. So this general in the Han army says what we need to do to regain control of this empire is kill all the eunuchs. But that plot gets found out, and the eunuchs launch a counterattack, and they kill the Han general who had ordered this massacre. When all of this starts to happen, when the eunuchs and this general, you have this assassination plot and the plot to kill all the eunuchs, the imperial family of the Han dynasty just breaks down. They collapse due to this constant scheming and palace intrigues. So when they fall apart, there are three different claimants to the throne. And a civil war is going to ensue. And those claimants all return to different regions of China, and the civil war takes place. But the warring parties would end this conflict in 208 Common Era, so that's what we now call AD. And they decide to split the empire up into three different states. And this would start the what they call the Three Kingdoms period of Chinese history. They break into the state of Wu, the state of Wei, and the state of Chu. And so those states are going to be kind of constantly fighting ground wars, deciding where their boundaries are at. But the Three Kingdoms period is going to begin right as the Han Dynasty ends. Now, let's take a look at our outcomes and our takeaways here. So, what have the Han really done? And when we look at this, this is impressive. They have pretty much established one of the most important governmental structures in all of Asian history when we look at it. They achieved incredible political influence, gaining control over almost all of modern China, and then well beyond those boundaries as well. Secondly, they established multinational trading networks that essentially it connected the whole of the old world, from Europe to Asia, North Africa and the Near East, everything in between. By building out and establishing a more effective Silk Road trade network, they have connected the old world together. They build one of Asia's most visible and well-known landmarks, a feat of the ancient world, the Great Wall of China. They implement a writing system that is still in use right up to today, by either in its old form or in a slightly changed form. It's being used by most of the populations of Asia. In many ways, they unified Chinese ethnic identities. After the Han Dynasty, there is a constant sort of dichotomy in Chinese society, one that we'll be taking a look at later in the course. But there's this dichotomy between to be Han means you're Chinese. To be not Han means that you're an outsider. You're from the north, you're from Korea, you're from Manchuria or Mongolia. You're from these regions beyond what they consider to be the heartland or core of China. In a lot of ways, to be Chinese is to be Han. And so in a lot of ways, they have they really contributed greatly to this conversation of what it means to be Chinese. And to what that national identity means in terms of an ethnic identity. So that's what they've done. And when you take all of this together, it's pretty impressive, right? They're doing this at a time when Northern Europeans are living in small hunter-gatherer villages, when the greatest empires the world's ever known, according to Western historians, the empires of the Greeks and the Romans, they are still living in basically flea-bit backwater communities with very little development of their societies. And China is basically putting together its modern boundaries and establishing transnational networks. This makes them quite a bit different than what we're seeing in any of the areas of Mesopotamia. It makes them different from what's happening in the Indus River Valley, and it changes their sort of historical trajectory. It makes it quite a bit different from what we'll see in the Nile as well. So that's what I want you to take away from that discussion of the Han Dynasty. Now, I am going to incredibly briefly. I almost feel bad that I'm even going to talk about it because I feel like I'm not doing it justice. But I am really trying to keep brief my discussion of Harappan India. And again, it goes back to the fact that I just don't know that much about it. And it's not just me, and it's not me being lazy and wanting to get on with my Pro Football Sunday. This is about me just having to admit to everybody that as historians and experts, they just don't know. They don't have a very clear idea of what's going on in Harappan India. So I'm going to tell you what I can, and I'm going to tell you what makes it unique before just kind of saying, let's stick a pin in it and see what happens in India a little bit later, because there will be some really key developments in this region of the world. And in a lot of ways, I think they are tied to some of the uniformity that's brought about by IVC or Harappan culture. So India's contributions to these emerging common cultures that we're seeing in the world at this point has been largely overlooked in the historiography of world history. For those of you unfamiliar, I've kind of been throwing the term out rather loosely, but historiography is the study of a field of history, meaning it's the history of what we as historians choose to look at and why, and how we talk about these different issues. And so it's simply put, it's the history of how we conduct history. But the I'm going to get this wrong. Harappan or Indus Valley civilization is poorly understood at best by historians and other archaeologists. It's really recent research that's gone into this. I mean, you can even go back, I don't want to date myself too much. We know far more about this area today than we did back when I was in grad school. As a PhD candidate, my world history advisor was an Indianist by training. He worked in this region of the world, far later date, looking more at like colonialism and stuff. But I asked him, I remember asking him about some of the news articles that they were talking about new Harappan digs and things like that, archaeology and findings from that area. And I said, what does this all mean to the sort of timeline and what's happening in Indian history? And he goes, I have no idea, and I don't know anybody who does. Because even Indianist historians don't know anything about this time period for the most part. Then there's not a lot to know. There simply is not a lot of evidence for us to work from. First, you've got to talk about India's climate. The subcontinent of India is hot. It's humid. This is a terrible, terrible environment to try to preserve anything. Other than for stone, that's about all we're left with. If there's anything carved on wood, it's gone. Anything on paper or parchment or anything like that, it's gone. And even the sort of nature of different types of stone, it tends to get pitted in tropical hot climates. In moist climates, it tends to sort of deteriorate a lot faster than it would in a place like China or Mesopotamia. And it's not just about heat. Obviously, it's hot in the Near East as well. It's not just heat, it's about humidity. And as Houstonians, I'm sure you all probably understand that aspect of it pretty well. Everybody would rather be in 110 degree heat in Phoenix than they would be here in Houston. So really what we're looking at is I'm trying just to avoid giving you these big generalizations about the culture, knowing that they're probably not all that accurate, because most of what we're talking about is poorly understood. And then in addition to the fact that there's no evidence for us here, we also have there's sort of a bias in the way that world history reporting has looked, because the root of Christian and Abrahamic civilizations, which will come, as you know, come to dominate the world later on. The Abrahamic traditions sort of become seen as the center of the world. So for a long time, historians who looked at these kinds of issues of common cultures in the ancient world said, why look at India? Nothing's going to happen there. It's too far off out of the beaten path. If the most, as they saw it back in the 19th and 20th centuries, they saw it as the most civilized cultures seem to have come out of the Middle East, then why would I look at India towards civilization? It wouldn't be there. They looked like a periphery. So ultimately, there are hundreds and hundreds of settlements in this region of the world during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. But the majority of Indus Valley civilization people, of their population, we think they were clustered around 5 major cities, because these are the 5 cities we found and we have evidence for. They were Harappa, I'm going to butcher some of these names, Mohenjo-Daro, Rakhigarhi, Dolavira, and Ganeriwala. So these are the areas these are the major cities, at least of the excavation sites. And as you can see, we've given the name of this culture, we tend to call it Harappan culture, entirely because of the type sort of site. They call it a type site in archaeology. Harappa became the first one that they dug out, and so they felt that everything else they dug out in these other places were just reflections of one similar culture that they called Harappan culture. In other words, they found that first. So that under the best estimate I can give you, and it's rather wide, is that this area housed about 1 to 5 million people in the Bronze Age. We don't know how many, and that's a pretty big window, but we know that somewhere in that range there were people living. That's a pretty big population for the region, but it's also a fairly big region. But this is a massive population that's being sustained around these cities and in these urban centers in the Indus River Valley in northern India and Pakistan. But the culture itself, we tend to date it between about 3300 BCE and 1900 BCE. With the large cities and a lot of the hallmarks of their culture and society, in other words, sun-dried brick building, the establishment of irrigation and sewage and drainage, all these things are happening more or less around 2600 BCE. So they have what they call mature and immature Harappan cultures, and it splits right around that date of 2600 BCE. Now, the Indus Valley cultures were really, really adaptive to outside influence. And in their heyday, they established South Asia's first truly agricultural settled society. They established mass production. They actually had like assembly line style production for different sorts of products back then. Mostly household products like urns and kilns and lots of different types of pottery and jugs and jars and things that average people would need on a daily basis. So they established metallurgy in this area, metalworking, and they had sophisticated trade networks and intricate hydraulic, sewage, and drainage systems. And really, it's that last point that kind of sets them off and apart from the other societies. They establish a far more sophisticated system of sewage and drainage. It looks very, very, very close to modern sort of sewage. Now, obviously, the material that they use to build it isn't going to be the same, but the ideas and the basic concepts of it are being established by the Harappan people, and you don't see that in other parts. And to give you an idea, people are throwing their human waste out into the streets and in the rivers. That's how they're getting rid of it in other societies. It's being moved to areas where it doesn't get back in to mix with the drinking water, and it's being treated naturally through the environment here in India. And so that's a major differential that puts them apart from some of the other groups we've looked at. But after developing numerous technologies and tactics to create these large urban centers on their own, this region also, unlike some of the other ones, this region's benefiting from large migrations, mostly from Persia, but also to a lesser degree from Mesopotamia. They're seeing huge numbers of migrants start moving in from Mesopotamia around 2200 BCE. And so they're not just developing these things internally, they're also borrowing it from migrants who move into their society. And so you have a massive influx of people move into this region, and a lot of people have argued that it's this influx of migrants, even though they come a little later than the break between mature and immature Harappan society. Um, Other scholars have stepped forward and said it's actually the migrants that make the society, not the people who were living there before. But that's something that's very speculative, and I think you could argue that chicken and egg back and forth all day. But we do know that there's a fairly high level of intercultural intermixing going on here between the Aryan migrants that are coming later, ones who are coming out of what is then Persia, Mesopotamian migrants, Semitic migrants. There are people kind of moving all over, and India seems to be one of the more popular spots, and Pakistan as well. So, I basically cut to the chase in your PowerPoint slide saying, what is it we need to know about the Harappan cultures that makes them different from the other ones? I'm already fully admitting to you that we don't know that much about them, so why are we even bothering to do a little case study on them here? And they're sizably different from the other imperial and territorial states that we've looked at to date, because first and foremost, we don't have any clear evidence of a central hierarchy in Harappan or IVC societies. Some scholars are saying, look, we see these massive cities. There's got to be somebody pulling the strings, right? There's got to be somebody in charge, but we have no evidence of it. There's no talk of leadership. There's no imagery associated with kingship. What we think we might be seeing here is a truly egalitarian society with no rulers in it. And if that were the case, that is unique not just to other cities, but even the smaller settlements. All have some sort of centralized authority or leadership at this point in human history. And so if they were able to establish some of these feats and they did so without a central power structure, this would just be absolutely perplexing. Basically, what you have there is a utopian society, if that is in fact true. And so without a central hierarchy here, there's three different views on what's going on in terms of leadership in Harappan society. One, they had one central emperor king in charge of all the Harappan cities and everything. We just don't have the evidence of it. That we're coming up short as scholars and as historians. We haven't found what we're looking for yet. So that's one view. That yes, they had centralization like everybody else, but we just don't know about it. Number two is that they did have some centralization on the local level. That every city had its own king. Every settlement had its own chief, and every settlement took care of itself. Every city took care of itself, but they did have well-articulated trade networks, so ideas and things could kind of pass back and forth from one city to the next. That's view number two. View number three, and it's actually gaining in traction mostly amongst some scholars who are from India in the first place, truly Indianist scholars. And they're saying that, the idea of a hierarchy is kind of foreign to Indian cultures anyway. They have them, but it's a later development that they think might have come from interaction with people from the Middle East, from the Arabian Peninsula, from areas like that. And they're saying, no, this society probably didn't have any rulers. They probably had a more egalitarian society where not necessarily democracy as we understand it to exist worked, but there was at least a ruling council of elders. Somebody who could have made decisions for the society, but they did so democratically. Now, the other thing that's different about these groups is that everybody in the Neolithic and Bronze Age is all worried about controlling water. Obviously, just from what I've talked about so far, the Harappan are far more successful at this. The Harappan culture is not just channeling water for agriculture. They're building intricate sewage systems, drainage systems. They likely had running water on demand. So basically the same thing we got. Now, it might not have been hot and cold, but they could turn something and water would come out, fresh, usable water. And so what you're having here is water on demand. That is huge. These are things this isn't going to happen for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in other areas of the world. And so when we talk about, you'll even have places, they don't have running water when you get to the beginning of the 20th century in places like the Ozarks in West Virginia. So you have places in America as late as 1900 Common Era don't have electricity and running water. Well, the Harappan don't have electricity, obviously, but they do have running water. And they have sewage systems. They have ways, and you go to medieval Europe, people are throwing their waste out of windows into the street. They're throwing human waste out. The Harappan culture said, no, we'll come up with a plan to get this out of here. And then finally, the Harappan cultures seem to have mastered sea-based navigation a little bit earlier than their counterpart cultures that we've been talking about. Everybody's got some limited ability to get out on the ocean and do some fishing. But the Harappan cultures actually built trade networks in the Indian Ocean to connect them to Mesopotamia. That's also what largely sparks, we think, this massive influx of Mesopotamian and Persian migrants down to the Indian subcontinent and to Pakistan adjacent to it. So that's the three basic things that you should take away from Harappan culture, what they've sort of done there, and what they've done that makes them different. But I am going to take a few more minutes just to talk about some interesting facts, or lack thereof, about this culture. And the first one I need to point out is that every other place we've looked at, you have cuneiform writing structures growing out in Mesopotamia. The Hansi script is taking hold in China. And here, we don't know. Again, I got to look at you and say every expert in this field will give you a different answer depending on what they think. But there's no consensus amongst academics as to what we have going on here. You would think that to do these kinds of intricate and sophisticated city building and all this stuff, they would have some city of writing or some system of writing in place. But to understand it, this is one of the problems with why we don't know that much about these cultures. When we talk about ancient Egypt, you have the Rosetta Stone. We eventually figured out how to translate it. We can read what they wrote and what they chiseled and what they put down. We can't do that for Harappan culture. We still don't understand their language. We don't understand any of their symbolism, and we don't even know if they had a written language. To date, there has been no success in finding a script that allows us to translate what's going on in their writing systems, if they even have one. So, again, we get some different views here. You have some people are saying that some of the evidence, what we have found is we found pots and things with different inscriptions on it, symbols, but we don't know if this is a written language, if it's a ritualistic language where they only make these symbols on religious things, or if these symbols have some more general meaning in a language. We don't know anything about that. And so, well, a lot of the symbols found on IVC artifacts are really a mystery to us. We do tend to agree that it shows us some supposed uniformity of language, writing, and religious worship amongst the IVC or Harappan people. And it directly translated into developments that are going to occur after the fall of the end of the Harappan period. But it's very likely that, but not proven, that Indus Valley civilization symbols and writing contributed to the development of the later Sanskrit language. Sanskrit is an Indo-Aryan language that began to develop right at the tail end of this period we're talking about, so a little bit around 1900 BCE. And really, it will form the language. It forms this language that's attested to in the Vedas, or the foundational ideologies of Hinduism. It's among one of the oldest languages in what a lot of linguists believe is a mother language or proto-language, off of which many other languages, including the ones that we're using to conduct this class, are built. But I've shown you some examples of Harappan culture, symbols and culture. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the relationship between IVC religion or Harappan religion and the world's oldest religion, Hinduism. So, the most enduring element of Harappan culture, I think, would arguably be, from my standpoint, religious practices. Like other points about the IVC or the Harappan people, the exact nature of their religious system is unknown, still disputed. There's a general consensus that, yes, they were polytheistic. They believed in the worship of more than one god. Yes, they're animistic, and that's something that's a little bit harder for people to wrap their heads around. But animism is essentially ascribing spiritual or deist qualities to a natural thing or phenomenon. In other words, this has been misinterpreted a lot in history. Europeans showed up. Most African religions that I'm familiar with were animist and polytheistic. And so Europeans showed up and they go, what is going on? These Africans, they worship snakes. They worship a stick. They worship rocks. I don't understand what I'm seeing. They don't even have a god. They call that rock as their god. That's not what's happening. That's a misunderstanding of animism. Animism is essentially believing that the spirit of a deity, the embodiment of that deity, is found in natural phenomena. So yes, they're not worshiping the snake. The snake is not the god. The snake is a representation of a god that they can't see, in much the same way as a Christian might pray to a cross. It's a symbol of the religion. It's a symbol of one's faith, but it's not necessarily the cross itself is not God. It doesn't matter. You can make a million crosses; they're not all God. But that's the same kind of idea here. Is they're practicing animism, where they tend to give animals, weather, trees, rivers, rocks, these kinds of things. They give them qualities of divinity. They say they represent the spiritual or deified world. So ultimately, there are some distinct similarities between the known deities of the IVC or Harappan people and the deities of later Hinduism. But there are a lot of similarities. And so, really, what we're seeing here is that in IVC religion, we found more religious artifacts than anything else from them, so it's kind of what we know the most about. They have two chief deities, one representing a male energy and one representing a female energy. This is equally similar. There's a similar tradition within Hinduism that's practiced. And so you can see a pretty neat correlation there. Many of the IVC deities had multiple faces or heads or limbs, and they tend to be surrounded by animals in their iconography, sometimes blended with animals as well. And these are all features that can clearly be seen in the Hindu pantheon as well. And in the PowerPoint lecture, I've given you some slides and showed you examples of this. But therefore, it is reasonable, and most scholars tend to assume that these IVC religions, really shortly after the fall of, or I guess you could call it just sort of the gradual decline of Harappan cultures, Hinduism is going to emerge about 400 years later. And so it's the world's oldest religion. It's practiced by over a third of the world, but about a third of the, well, maybe not that much. I'm overshooting it. 15 to 16% of the global population. But it's a major global religion. It's the world's oldest religion, and it definitely has clear ties to the Harappan culture that we've been talking about here today. So ultimately, there's some takeaways from all of this. But I've sort of narrowed it down for you. What I want you to do is just kind of focus in on the few key points we talked about related to the Harappan people, but really focus in on some of the details of the Han Dynasty lecture. But just know what makes these two societies kind of unique. For a long time in history, nobody even really bothered looking at their developments in this time period, thinking they're probably living like barbarians like everybody else because life hasn't even developed in Europe yet. But that's an incredible way, a Eurocentric way of thinking, right? Well, if Europe's not living in civilizations, then nobody else is probably doing it either. And so clearly there's some interest in paying attention to these non-Western societies, these non-European societies, and how they developed, rise, and fell, trying to build these elaborate and sophisticated states out during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. Well, that wraps it up for me. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to send me an email. Take care. Have a good week.